Hello, Isaac.
Hello, Rabbi. Good afternoon.
Wow, that Sermon on the Mount is going on for days. I don't know how Jesus is sitting so long without getting a cramp, as
It's
opposed to as opposed to standing in Luke, of course.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
but it's also quite remarkable for the way it's structured. We call this a Sermon on the Mount, but I don't get the impression the sermon is more a blessing. It starts with blessed. Again, the we discussed the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments starts with you do something, you honor God, don't do this, don't do that. This doesn't feel like a sermon. It feels more like I want to bless you. Blessed are the poor in
Well,
spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And
I
so,
don't view this as blessing at all, but I will
ah,
note,
I'm
we noted
surprised.
we noted in 5:2 that
Uh-huh.
we said that Jesus spoke and taught. So the point is that Matthew doesn't frame this as a sermon. One thing that I guess we didn't speak about, there's 5 sections in Matthew that generally people view as to parallel the 5 sections of maybe the Psalms or the 5 books of Moses, that there's 5 sections of teachings inserted into the book of Matthew. Like, I don't know, like, when we talk about, form criticism, text criticism, about how this text came about, it's very clear that there were narratives and there were teachings. And those things were kind of separate historically. And then when the book of Matthew was getting put together, composed, they were kind of stuck in it. So, chapter 5 to chapter 8, as you can see, is a break of the narrative. There's a form of teaching, and there's 4 more sections like this in Matthew. And to that, we have to say, the fact that it's called Sermon on the Mount, the fact is, one of the ironies about the 10 Commandments, very, very, like, every Jew knows, very famous. The 10 Commandments aren't called the 10 Commandments by the Bible. They're called the 10 Statements, because some of them are commandments, and some of them, the first one, at least according to traditional read of what the 10 Commandments are, is that know that I'm your God. And generally, knowledge or recognition is not viewed as commandments. So just like the 10 Commandments are in no way probably internally viewed by the religion as commandments, I also feel Sermon on the Mount is not really a sermon. Over here, what we see is, even when you compare the Sermon on the Plain in Luke to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, you see there's a lot of things that aren't sermonic in with what you're noting.
Yep.
Blessed are you people who this, I view that as, part of my sapiential eschatological viewpoint, that is kind of telling us of what the kingdom of heaven is supposed to be. I do not view it as the meek, the poor, the sad, the mourning are being blessed here. I don't know, it sounds like you do. I view it as he's trying to recognize what it would be to live in the kingdom of heaven now, and that these people would be viewed differently. But did whatever blessing means, was a poor person blessed there? No. Okay, that's how I view it.
So before we go, so help me understand. You said that you do not view this as a blessing. So what do you view them as? Like, how do you? It's not a commandment. It's not a commandment. So I look at this in similar way as Psalm 1. Psalm 1 starts with, blessed is a man, it goes on, right? And so, so do you see this any different from Psalm 1?
So I think Psalm 1 is great because it also, in Hebrew, it very, very, very 100% confident does not say blessed in Hebrew. In that case, we spoke about in our last session, it says the word ashrei, which I view as mean content, but it could also mean happy. And we talked to Deuteronomy yesterday. Blessed are the people who, when they come, when they go. Again, there's different definitions of what it means to be blessed. And, it's very easy to talk about blessing as you'll be physically rewarded, you'll have children.
No, okay, no, I
but
think we discussed,
here,
right? Blessing is much bigger. It exceeds, it's not limited to physical blessing.
Well,
we discussed.
You spoke about yesterday as almost, again, no offense, as almost like meaningless, for you to recognize that it's good for the things that you have. So, that was very philosophical of you. And I think the sophists would be very impressed with that kind of attitude towards blessing. But most people feel blessing as something that's unilaterally taking place, right? There's something here, and then something over here will happen. So when we speak, for example, that all the people will bless themselves through Abraham's blessing, a lot of times it's a viewpoint, and I guess there's 2 different ways to look at it. So over here again, it sounds like you agree that it's not talking about unilateral something happening over here from Jesus going to over there. It's talking about more a recognition, just as you say, Ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach b'derech. Blessed be the person, or praiseworthy or content be the person who acts in this way. So I view it as the way that Psalm 1 happens as well.
I need to go revisit yesterday. You said yesterday what we spoke was meaningless. I felt it was I felt well, I felt it was filled with meaning, and I'm surprised you call it. I'm surprised you called
I mean
it
meaningless in a
meaningless.
nihilistic way that I have to find the meaning and seek it out. Existentially meaningless, but superbly meaningful.
Existentially meaningless, but superbly meaningful. Wow. Well, now you're sounding like Rabbi Sachs with all these creative words, and I have to think, what exactly is Rabbi Russ saying? Anyway,
Who knows what these things mean? Okay, very excited. Let's continue the Sermon on the Mount. We're gonna hopefully, I hope to read 2 verses today, so we could start that.
the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verse 4 onwards. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
So I feel before we even get started, it's always good because you're the one who has this context. And let's be honest, 2 or 3 of the lines from the Beatitudes are some of the most famous lines that Christians know. So I think it's good to start with like, Isaac, what does this mean? What does it mean to you?
Like, what do you mean? What has this been helping?
Blessed are those, when a normal person who reads verse 4 said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, will not understand what that means.
So, thank you for clarifying. So, I would not read the verse 4 in isolation. It's part of a message, and so I look, yeah, okay, or it's part of a set of verses. So I look at verse 4 and verse 4 and 5 as a continuation from verse 1. Verse 1, to me, it starts with the awareness of poverty, the awareness that life is, again, or this lack of again, this need for help, this need for external help, and from that awareness, this is what causes a person to act, as in to mourn and to ask for help. And that's one way to look at it. And then the meek. So if I were to summarize what I'm trying to say, it's hard for, I would not look at these verses in isolation. I would look at them as part of the context of 3, 4, 5, and each one building, adding more flavor.
Perfect sense. And
well, that's great.
Well, I'm not going to agree, but I'm saying it makes perfect sense what you're saying, in that one could view the 10 Commandments as God giving a revelation to man. That's one way to look at it. And the fact, don't kill, don't steal, don't whatever, it's not inherently, it's the message. But one of the things that we focus on here during our sessions is worrying about words. So if anything, I'm going to ask you to take off those goggles of seeing the whole sermon as either 8 lessons or 10 lessons or 4 lessons, however you do it. And now let's try to view it anew. So when we see blessed are those who mourn, what does that mean? So let's take a couple. We already talked about blessed yesterday, and I thought maybe it'd be helpful to take a couple steps back to talk about a couple ideas. So number one, we can't view the Beatitudes without always comparing to Luke. While we have 8 over here, generally that people view Luke having 4. But I think, first of all, it's really interesting how most people will note how they're flipped over here. That we say that they're somewhat out of order. But when you look at number 21, a lot of people will view them as parallel. So let's just look at Luke 21 for a context. You don't have to agree that they're the same, but a lot of people will view them as oral teachings that got from a sermon that got passed down and be very, very similar. So what it says is, blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. And I think it's really interesting to at least have that parallel, that mourning in that context, if you want to say from the Lukean context, it just means you're sad. You're weeping. It might be caused by mourning, from my perspective, which I think we're going to explore, will be 1,000 times stronger than weeping. Weeping is a strong word for cry, but it's just crying. You could cry over spilt milk. You could cry over you hurting yourself. Mourning is catastrophe. Mourning equals something horrible happened. You lost a loved one. You lost part of your identity. You lost your nation. So I think that if the source is Luke, you're sad, and you comfort, you'll laugh. Luke is beautiful in that it's like you have opposites. And I think somewhat of the Beatitudes is about opposites, right? You start here and you finish there, which is, we talk about binary. You start poor, you finish rich. You start crying, you finish laughing. So it's very interesting to think of things in binary terms, but we all know in reality, a lot of times the binary realities don't start there. So I think to start with this idea that mourning is inherently stronger than crying, I think is our starting point. So that's one background I want to give. The other one, which I should have read to you yesterday, but I thought it was really interesting. I don't know if you have a Bible, a Tanakh, a Old Testament
Of
in front
course,
of you.
I mean, of course I do. You mean I not have a Tanakh? What do you mean,
I just meant as
Rabbi?
opposed to knowing it all by heart, you know. So if you look at Isaiah chapter 61, I told you Isaiah has a special place in Matthew's heart. I think has a special place in first century Judaism's heart. I think that when Jesus sometimes goes into a synagogue, he'll be saying, can you read Isaiah? Because Isaiah is the go-to place. So if you look at chapter 61, a lot of commentators will view chapter 61 as a source of the ideology or the parallels to the Beatitudes. So I'm not here to criticize or note the parallels because who knows, but I think it's worthwhile for us to read the first 3 verses out loud in English for you to at least hear a possible historical parallel context for what the Beatitudes were working with. Even if you want to say it's subversive or it's using as a launching pad, it's good to see that launching pad. So I'll
Yeah,
just
I think,
yes.
yeah, thank you for that observation. And I think as I mentioned yesterday, right, the brilliance is not so much in saying something new. The brilliance was in, like, for example, 5:3 could be summarized to say, be humble. In a context, again, could be humble. And he was moving this from doing something to a place of identity, as in it's not what you do, but who you become, or it's move things from the exterior to the interior. And so now I don't mean, again, I don't mean to say that what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount of the Beatitudes is something completely new, as in he just brought something out of thin air. No, it's more as in taking the things in there, but explaining this, giving this in a new context,
Or you're giving
or
like
moving things from the from as some of this is less about doing, but more to a state of being, which would have been revolutionary back then as it is now. And and that's how I viewed this. I don't look at this as those who mourn as in, oh, I've got to cry, I've got to be, again, people have to feel sadness, but more as in to carry that burden within ourselves from a state of being, and how that shapes how we view the world.
You're speaking of a very first of all, we just spoke about this like early, like an hour ago at our staff meeting about how Rabbi Berman specifically was talking about how do you the 5 Torot are values that have always existed, but you're speaking about a very strong sensitivity. I think that we're always have to look for in Christianity. Jesus has to be revolutionary without being revolutionary, right? Because he has to use, and I have a book over here, what was it called? Early Jewish Hermeneutics in Palestine. And that would be first century hermeneutics. And what you're describing is a hermeneutic, a way to expand upon the verse while still using the verse as your starting point. And I think this is a sensitivity that Christians, at least in the beginning, again, I don't want to speak for Paul, but definitely Matthew is going to have a very strong sensitivity towards that. There's going to be a boundary. You can't go too far. You can't say God was a goat. You can't say God doesn't exist. You can't be a nihilist about certain things, but you could take the text and expand upon it. And as long as you don't go past a boundary that early first century Christians would say too far, you could do it. And I think that's why I'm saying Jesus has to be a revolutionary while not being a revolutionary. He has to say, be humble, but he could say be humble, but he can't say it differently. He can't say, for example, commit suicide right now because we should live in heaven of God. That would be 100% a message that could resonate for people who can be you want to be in the kingdom of heaven? I got a one-way ticket, which is very fast and simple. But Jesus, that would be past the boundary. That would be normative. So it's really interesting to try to find these. So you're saying that the Sermon on the Mount is pushing the boundary, expanding it, but it's still within the fence.
Well, thank you for that background and for that explanation. Actually, I should probably mention that one of the ways in which I look at this is through the lens of Matthew 4:17, where Jesus says, "I did not come to abolish the law of the prophets, but I have come to fulfill the law." But to fulfill the law, and so I look at this as he's working with the context of the law, but what new additional insight he brings, or how does he place himself in the context of that law or the context of the law, and so So that's been a way in which I have viewed the Sermon on the Mount and most of his teachings as in how does he take what is there in the new, which we've known, which has been revealed over time through prophets and kings and prophets and through all the sages over time, and what different dimension that does Jesus add to it? It's not as in something completely new, but as in some ways embodying some of this and bringing it to life.
Yeah, so
Anyway,
it's not 417 though, right?
oh sorry,
417.
I'm sorry, 517. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
I
Okay.
mean
Yeah,
five
417.
7.
417 is our favorite. Repent, the kingdom of
Oh,
heaven.
repair, that's right. Repair the
It,
kingdom of
it,
heaven is at
pro-
hand.
it probably accidentally slips off your tongue regularly. You're in the shower and you're just like, repent.
Now that we've spoken, I'm just surprised by how often this verse is quoted. It comes in Peter, it comes in Joel, it comes in all the prophets, but each one uses this in a different context, in a
That's what we're
different.
talking about, right?
Yeah.
Expanding the boundaries. One of the things that the rabbinic texts, this is literally what rabbinic texts are known for. They're hermeneutics. We talk about 7 or 13 hermeneutic principles, ideas that either God or mankind has made up in order to expand the infinite nature of the text. So this is something that I think that Jews are going to be super, super sensitive to and want to. And when I think about what it means to have Jesus give a class, to teach in the synagogue, that's what I imagine he's doing. He's saying, this is a verse. I could take it out of its context, or I could use a principle here in order to make sure that it is being used. Okay, let me read that Isaiah text to you, just the first 3 verses. As I said, we probably should have read this yesterday. So chapter 61. The Spirit, again, this is, I don't know what translation this is. Take it with a grain of salt, the translation. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. So first of all, Christians, are salivating when they hear this. This sounds like so Christian. So this is a great text. Okay. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. So I use this as an example as what we spoke about yesterday, where no one who read this thought that this prophet is meant to release the prisoners or free the captives. There's always this dichotomy of literalism versus what is the poetry of the text. Okay. Verse 2, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. So you see, we already had to proclaim good news to the poor. Mm-hmm. Number 2, to comfort all, again, we're skipping a little because that's brokenhearted, captives, prisoners. But then we see to comfort all who mourn, and then goes on to provide all those who grieve in Zion. So if anything, we see this kind of point of it going forward. Let's read it further. To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, planting of the Lord, display. Okay, goes on and on. So definitely read it in your spare time. A lot of people see the parallels, and there's not a necessary benefit of seeing the parallels aside from they're both poetic. They're both really nice to read. And there definitely is an idea that if Matthew could root itself, even in the order of biblical verses, as we said, you get a check, you get a point, you get a credit, you get an extra life in a video game. So, there may not be an inherent value, but whenever you can root yourself in a biblical text, your point is inherently more important, validated, superior, beneficial. Okay, so that was the Isaiah text. So I guess we could go on.
Well, thank you. Now, this text is quoted in Luke, right? In Luke chapter 4, this text is quoted where Jesus is in the synagogue, and he takes the scroll, he reads prophet
Right. So that's
Isaiah.
what I mentioned earlier, that
so
he walks into a synagogue, Isaiah, go-to text, right?
Yeah, and so he was talking in the first person as like he was a person doing this, like he placed himself. Anyway, but that's my take from Luke. So
right. All the more so, this is a cited verse. This is an important section. And therefore, again, it's even more so if you could show some parallels to beatitudes. Blessed be Baruch Hashem.
Yeah. So what he's done is he's so far he said, like, I'm the messenger who's been sent to show, to pave the way for those who are brokenhearted, again, for people who are poor, the brokenhearted, the captives, the blind, the oppressed, and the Sermon on the Mount is him showing how to, in some ways, how to do it, or broad. I mean, I'm not saying how to do it, but probably
No, I
expanding more
understand what
on,
you're saying.
probably expanding more on that, as in it's not what you do, but who you become. And it's not because of what Jesus did, but who he was by his way of living and his life, that he was able to do what he was called to do. And so I look at Matthew 5 as him saying, if you want to follow me, here's the kind of people you have to become or be. Or but that's, again, to your point, it's more allegorical. It's more you know
Yeah, again,
it's
yeah, 100%. Whenever you see the poetry of Isaiah, it's always a question what modern man could do it, let alone first century man. But anyways, we see that it was an important text. Okay, so let's get started now. Now we gave our 20-minute introduction to what we're talking about. So the first point I want to note about blessed are those who mourn is that while everyone pretty much says that mourn, some people want to note that mourning might mean oppressed. And I think to even talk about blessed are those who are oppressed, so the comfort does fit with the idea. I don't personally see a benefit of exploring it because it says mourned, but I want to note that at least there's that idea. So why would someone be mourning, Isaac? We know why someone would be poor in spirit. We know why someone would be poor. But why would someone be mourning? Blessed are those who mourn. It's very specific. And I want to argue it's definitely much stronger than blessed are you who weep now in Luke. So why would someone mourn? Who is he speaking to? If it's more than an allegory, who could he be speaking to?
again, at this point, he's speaking to the multitudes and the disciples, right? And so I read this in the context of that Jesus prayed day and night. As in, I look at fasting as a form of mourning, asking for help. He fasted 40 days, 40 nights. He didn't have to, but he did. He prayed all through the night, and that comes
Well,
on later
the
chapter.
prayers from the Lukean text, don't forget, that's not in ours.
Yeah. So in terms of so to your question, why do we mourn? I want to put this back. Why should we not mourn? Like, should it?
That's not a fair question. You don't mourn, I guess, unless a tragedy takes place. I don't walk around mourning. That's not a fair question.
Because there's so much of suffering in life.
Oh my God, listen to you. There's so much suffering. No one mourns. Unless you're Camus, who's suffering because of absurdism and looking for meaning. No one mourns without reason.
I mean, but as an existentialist, mourning is part of my, I mean, that's how I look at this. Like, again, as a Christian existentialist, I mean, mourning is a part of my way of life, and I go, I'm not able to explain why you should mourn. I mean, if I'm not an existentialist, maybe I might give you a different answer. But as an existentialist, I want to say I'm deeply. I mean,
okay. Well, I hear Camus is loving this right now, so great. But I want to also just put this also. I want to, I guess, explore two ideas. Number one, we cannot forget that this text was written after the temple was destroyed. When the Beis Hamikdash, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, a rabbinic Judaism institutionalized various mournings as a way of life. So a lot of people don't realize this. I can make you a list of them. But for example, there's even Maimonides notes that maybe we should never listen to music today. He lived 1,000 years after this time period, more. And he said maybe one of the consequences of living in a post-Second Temple destruction is we shouldn't be listening to music. Another example of mourning, some people would say we shouldn't eat meat or drink wine because we are mourning. So I give you a whole nother list. And at the end of the day, that this attitude didn't win out, because what happened in the first century with the rabbis in, as we mentioned, Judea and Samaria, is that they decided that life must go on. Let's put sacrifices kind of behind us. And let's imagine that the mourning should be minimal, but not a maximalist attitude. So we'll note that, like at a wedding, we'll break a glass at a Jewish wedding. So we should have a temple, and my kids and my family will strive and wants to have a temple rebuilt, but it will not be an active part of every single thing in our life. Because when you have mourning, that's an active part of your identity, you see the world differently. And I think that when we understand what mourning was taking place, and when this was written, an active mourning, like poor in spirit, we know we could think of people, but the mourning that was taking place by the Jewish people who were just ravaged, hundreds and hundreds of thousands were killed. Forget about the Christians who were also killed. The nation of Judea had hundreds of thousands of people killed, and they're going to have another several hundred thousand killed in another 40 years. So I think to have this idea of living in a post-temple era when mourning was still being debated as a way of life really puts this text in a different context. Blessed are those who mourn. A person who mourns is a person who grieves, a person who takes the past loves that he had and takes them into the future. And where the way that I see that it parallels poor in spirit, and that is that, I guess what you're saying, Camus, but I'm giving not an existential read, but a historical read. There is a reason for someone to walk around mourning, just like there's a reason for someone to walk around poor in spirit because of their upbringing, their history, and what led them in their education. So too, Jesus is noting that some people inherently, because of either the temple or just because of life in general, as you're saying, should walk around and mourn. And those people who walk around and mourn are noting the absence of the kingdom of heaven in their lives. And when they note the fact that the world is not working the way that they are, it's unsustainable and unacceptable. And therefore, Jesus is saying that those people who specifically live a life of mourning, of grief, who cannot find a sense of wholeness, those people will be able to be comforted. Why?
Amen. Because as an existentialist, that's like music to my ears. As
Oh,
in,
there you go. I try to speak directly to existentialists in general.
No, so let me put it this. So how do you so to the people who first heard this, to the initial hearers, what is the connection between verse 3 and verse 4? Verse 4 comes after verse 3, and so we're looking at this as in two separate things. I get that, but to the initial audience, would they have made a connection between 3 and 4, or was how would they have felt? Or
so I want to know two things. Number one, have you ever been to a Shakespearean play?
No.
So I have, and I personally find it meaningless because I can't follow that quickly. The language is too foreign to me. And when I read, I actually took a class on Shakespearean poetry, and where you're able to see how deep the text really is, it's almost mind-boggling that anyone could think that they can understand anything that's taking place in the moment. So I feel that we always have to take that into account when we read, especially the beatitudes, which are meant to be deep. They're meant to be sermonic. They're meant to impact the people long-term. Nothing that you hear on the spot could really be impactful unless it's clear. These things, I think, might have been subversively clear, but past the subversiveness, it would have been really hard to have an instantaneous impact without further discussion and further analysis. And I think that leads into the second question you had. I think it'd be meaningful for us, maybe once we get to verse 12, 13 in this chapter, to try to see an order to why these took place 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But again, I just don't believe that people could find order and meaning without it actually having a separate perspective. I actually heard a famous Christian academic, John Dominic Crossan, one time say, you could destroy the word atomically, biologically, chemically, demographically, economically, and then he stopped. And I was like, I think those are in alphabetical order. And then he said, and that's only up to E. So I caught his point because it stood out to me. But I think that if the Isaiah text was rooted in their subconscious or their consciousness, then they might have felt the parallels, like, I hear Isaiah getting fulfilled in this. That's possible. But we always have to be wary, especially in these kind of oral texts, of like, what kind of instantaneous gratification could the text hearer, when they heard the sermon, have felt? And again, I'm not saying when Rabbi Sachs speaks or when other great preachers speak that you can't be instantaneously gratified and feel instantaneously moved. But I'm saying the depth of the words can't be felt, in my opinion, just like I can't get Shakespeare. Okay. So again, like we did talk, just to finish off 4, before we start 5, we talked about binaries, about are these opposites. And I do think it's really interesting for us to think, when he says mourn, what kind of mourning is he talking about? Extreme versus not, and what kind of grief are we talking about? And we talk about comforted. Are we talking about a person now who's doing a 180? They are completely seeing the world anew, or is he kind of trying to set up a realistic and more pragmatic kind of ministry? We're saying those people who mourn, they could be comforted, but they won't anymore cease to experience that pain. One of the ideas that modern people, when they talk about a grief recovery handbook, you will not cease to have the mourning, but you'll be able to use it for good. You'll no longer, you might still be poor in spirit, but you'll be able to see the kingdom of heaven. I think we always have to think about, is Jesus giving a 180 or is he giving a 160? Where he's saying the mourning will be gone, you'll be comforted, but you still will have reason more. And one of the things that there's a Zechariah text that talks about in the future, Messianic text says, when people mourn, they will do this. And it always struck me because it's still noting that there's mourning in a Messianic era. So a lot of times I view Messianic era as either seraphic, angelic, magical, awesome in a way that there's no parallels, which we're going to actually talk about when we talk about the next verse. But it's a good question for us to ponder. When he says these things, how does Jesus imagine the kingdom of heaven?
So, well, thank you for that, right? But so when we say blessed are those who mourn, for they should be comforted, I look at this as you mourn right now, but in the coming kingdom of heaven, which is the future kingdom, and I cannot point to this in a point in time. And he was pointing to the future kingdom whenever that kingdom is established, as in that future kingdom that you'll be comforted. So, are you saying that
future kingdom? That's now.
It's not,
You shouldn't say Isaac. You shouldn't say future anymore. We're in chapter 5. That now kingdom.
Okay. So just thinking out loud. So, are you saying that he's saying the kingdom is now greater, the kingdom is here, like this is the kingdom of heaven, and so in this new kingdom, even though as being part of this kingdom, even though you mourn, you would live in a way in which you aren't mourning. Like, is that what you're saying? So even though you feel this pain,
the binary nature, you could read this text as, I think Luke 4:20 was the best one. Those who are weeping will laugh. If you're laughing, you're not weeping anymore. The weeping has been destroyed. It's a 180. You did a full circle. You went from not full circle. You went from weeping, sadness. Now you're laughing. You can't weep and cry. So when you mourn, if you're comforted, there's one way to look at it, that you did a 180, just like in Luke, that you're no longer mourning. But another way to look at it is that you'll be comforted, but your mourning you'll still have who you are inside. And I think that's the question when we look at all these. When you're poor in spirit, would you call someone who was poor in spirit and is now in the kingdom of heaven still poor of spirit? And I think this is one of the things that we're actually going to talk about this in 10 seconds, so we could jump to the next one. But this is exactly, I think, one of the things when we have to imagine, I think one of the problems that sometimes Christians have is that we still have poor of spirit in the kingdom of heaven. And I think if you imagine as binary texts where they are opposites, it's really hard to understand what Jesus could have meant. And therefore, again, like I would have no problem saying the opposite of mourning is comforting, but I think especially with our knowledge of how grief works today and mourning today, no one really views them as opposite, because people understand that mourning continues. There's just like crazy mourning where like you're depressed, and then there's mourning that I recognize that my love continued, and I always have to have that as part of my identity and continue. And therefore, when I'm comforted, it's not a comfort of a decimation of the mourning. It's a comfort that works in supplementary to the mourning. Okay, let's do a verse
Rabbi,
5.
that's beautiful. That's a beautiful homily, Rabbi. You should give this on a Sabbath morning in synagogue, or if it's
Saturday,
or I mean Friday at a synagogue or Sunday at church. What you just said is a beautiful homily where and Rabbi Sachs comes to the exact same thing, but he comes to this in just different ways. I can't mimic it, but he says where God doesn't take things away, but he gives, again, that mourning becomes a part of our life, and that becomes, the mourning is still there, but it comes out in a different form, or we become a different person, and so we still have this joy and parts of this mourning, which anyway, but thank you for that. It's a good something to think about, and it's a good homily.
Should we do the next verse, or should we stop here?
We can do the next verse.
Your call. Okay, so we already read it. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So there's a lot of really important ideas here. So before we even analyze the verse, there's something that you said yesterday, which I think we should bring up. You said Matthew is before Luke. How can Matthew be quoting Luke? And I think this is the best example of. It's not that Matthew is quoting Luke. Is that there's a Matthean text, a Lukean text, and a Q text, right? And a lot of times when it could be that Luke would have the original text and Matthew will either A, omit it, delete it, or Matthew will alter it, as we know the Matthean text does. So I think it's very common to see that Matthew might have something that you could see was originally in Luke, but now it's different or flipped or changed. And I think that's like not in any, like we shouldn't view that as a problem. Even if Luke was, I don't know, canonized, but finished or formally written 20 years later. So I just want to note that. And we see the reason I'm noting it here is because it happens here. So number one, so blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. I think it's always good to start with your perspective, as you should have perspective. So what does this mean, Isaac?
Well, based on what we on what we discussed before, as in, I don't look at this as being a 180 degree, and it's more as in being meek, as in feeling a sense of powerlessness, and because the values of this world, or the values at this time when Jesus spoke, it's the Romans were ruling over Romans were in power, and the most confident, the most aggressive person is the one who wins, and being meek is the exact opposite of all of that. And he said, even though you feel meek in this new kingdom, because of heavenly kingdom, the values are being changed, and even by being humble and polite and kind, and by being meek, you'll still be able to. You will still inherit the earth. And I think we've got to put this in context where the Romans, Herod, the Romans were ruling over the Jewish people, were ruling in Judaism, and they were defined by being ruthless, and by being aggressive, and by being harsh. So the sense of meekness there would have been seen as weakness, and he's taking something which is weak and giving hope to it, or defining this in a different way, how this applies in this new kingdom. That's my.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this is probably the most famous of the Beatitudes, right? This one, possibly meek, whatever, probably. So, or maybe. So 100%. This one will focus on weakness. I don't think we need to further explain. I do think there's such a strong parallel to either poor or poor in spirit to weak. But what actually intrigues me more is the second half of the verse, which I imagine you never cared as much about. The reason, no, I don't mean as a condemnation. I'm saying, like, they don't inherit the earth. What does that mean? So I feel like what I want you to do now.
You're the rabbi, and I'm here listening. Yeah. Uh-huh.
What I want you to do is I want you to compare the end of verse 5 to the end of verse 3, namely, for they will inherit the earth versus for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I want you to tell me, is that just a synonym, or do they mean something different? Is he being poetic? Could he have written for theirs is the kingdom of heaven again? Or does this mean something different?
I don't know. I
don't want honesty. I want guesses.
I don't know, because we're in the kingdom of heaven. That's that's been inaugurated.
Okay, let me read you a rabbinic text, and maybe this definitely will not shed light on it, but it'll maybe help you. Okay, so this is a Mishnah, which means it was from the 1st to 3rd century. It's from Sanhedrin, chapter 10. This is so famous, this text, that I would say, like, most Jews who have any knowledge of text will be very aware of this. It's not quite blessed are the meek, but it's a close second. Okay, the text goes, it says all of Israel, which generally means all the Jewish people, but whatever. All the Jewish people have a share in the world to come. Good. As is stated, and here's the verse from Isaiah, of course, chapter 60, the verse, right? All your people also shall be all righteous. I'm just used to the Hebrew. For they shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, for my name to be glorified. And that's from Isaiah 60:21. And then it goes a list of all the exceptions. So the reason this is really important is because when you read this, the verse doesn't seem to support the text. The text says all the Jews go to heaven. And then, like I said, the rest of the chapter is all the million exceptions. But at least as a starting point, everyone should go to heaven. And the verse starts by saying, and your nation, they are all righteous forever. They will forever inherit. They're all righteous. They will forever inherit the earth. So how do you get from they will forever inherit the earth that they all go to heaven? If anything, those are maybe means like your kids will forever, you'll bequeath to your kids, or all the 12 tribes will over be on the land. It seems to be opposite. How, if you forever inherit the land, will you be forever go to heaven? And in the Rabbinic Text, it actually says the next world. How will it be if the Jews will always get the next world if they'll inherit the land forever? And I think this Mishnah really elucidates our point in 5:3 versus 5:5. It turns out, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I'm sure you see it in Christian art. You've probably seen this notion. When I describe it for you, you'll either be aware of it or not, but you'll say like, oh, this makes sense in art all everywhere. There's two very contradictory, contrasting, and different notions of what heaven is.
Mm-hmm.
So one notion is that heaven on earth, that there will be thousands of everything will be green, the trees will look great, the fruit will grow, maybe we'll be a little more angelic, maybe we'll be less physical, but we're not in heaven. We're sitting on earth. The Messianic era this is post-Messianic era. The Messiah came, Messiah did whatever he or she had to do. And now what happens is that we're just living in like a new Garden of Eden. Everything is freaking awesome. That's one vision of heaven. Another vision of heaven is, what we generally believe. We go up, we die, we go up to heaven, we disappear, and our spirits, our souls do, they reside with God forever. Have you ever heard that these two different attitudes of heaven?
Yeah.
And when you think of Christian art, you see it all the time. So what I want to note is the possibility of two very, very different attitudes towards heaven based on these on 5:3 verse 5:5. But let's just bring it back to rabbinic text first. What is this rabbinic text? The Jewish people all get the next world. Well, what does the next world mean? Does it mean in heaven or on earth? They will forever inherit the land. Just means this text is a physical manifestation of the next world. You'll forever inherit the land because you'll forever live on the land. You'll forever live here. Even when Jews sometimes talk about Tchias HaMesim, resurrection of the dead, and then Maimonides has such a problem with resurrection of the dead. He's very much a Neoplatonist. So he goes, where's the real world? It's the soul world. It's the invisible world. There's no bigger punishment for the soul than to be trapped in the body for Maimonides. So when he says you're going to be resurrected, he goes, oh, you're resurrected so you could die again. Because you can't live in this world forever. That's a punishment to your soul. But if you're a good Christian, or if you take this Mishnah seriously, you could live in this world forever. Why not? So now let's look at these two verses and see if this helps explain. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They will inherit the earth. If we want to at least pretend, I'm not saying the reality, you can say this is all poetry, but those are two different things. How can we now explain those two different things differently?
Yeah. So, well, thank you for the Mishnah, and thank you for the distinction, but which is the broad
We
categories.
haven't said the distinction yet. We have to figure out what the distinction is.
Yeah. So I look at this as I don't look at heaven as some mystical place up above. I look at heaven as a place where God dwells, and that's generally what's called heaven. I don't think this heaven represents a geographical location. It's more as in the space which God inhabits. And so when I read
So
this,
you're more than Neoplatonist school. That's great.
So when I read this through the lens of Jesus, as in God, the God man, as in God came to earth in man. I look at him. I look at Jesus, his work in his life as redeeming this earth, and so like this earth is part of God's. I look at his life and his work as part of redeeming this earth, as in this earth is part of this earth is part of God's creation. And so as Christians we look forward to this new day and new kingdom and new however this is, but it's not as in some mystical place, but it's this world which is made new. And in some ways I feel like he's saying that to live in that new kingdom, to live in that world is to be meek and to also have poverty in spirit. And so I conflate or I mix up kingdom of heaven and earth. Heaven not necessarily meaning a geographical location, heaven meaning the space where God dwells. And if God dwells on earth, then earth becomes heaven, heaven becomes earth.
Okay, well, that totally makes sense. At least the suggestion I want to make for Matthew.
Well, this is my again. I'm not saying this is correct, but that's one way in which I read this. Yeah.
What do we know, Isaac? We never claim that anything's correct. We're just our observation. Okay, so when it says the blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, I think what I imagine the kingdom of heaven is specifically this attitude, right, of Jesus having his messiahship, and specifically happening from a viewpoint. But I don't personally feel that it means that a person has to inherently have a different kind of life. It's the potential for a different kind of life. But what's really interesting about they will inherit the earth, the meek. So number one, meek are usually people who don't inherit, and I'll explain why in a second. But what's interesting is that if anything, it has this connotation of a heaven on earth, just like we see in the Mishnah, that specifically that this will take place on earth. And while I personally view kingdom of heaven as earth, I just want to note for you, I forgot kingdoms like Basileia in Greek, but let's like take the word seriously for a second. Kingdom of
Heaven.
Why is it not kingdom of earth? I think for us to pretend that the word heaven is not there would be for us to misinterpret the text.
Mm-hmm.
In the end of the day, the kingdom of heaven, as much as you and I possibly want to pretend or recognize that it's intended to be something now on earth, it's inherent in the words that, and I think a lot of Christians take this way, that it's just something that's in the next world. It's in heaven, something that you can't access now. So I think to set up this dichotomy of heaven versus earth, 3 versus 5, is very clear and conscious, a conscious decision. What I also want to note is the word inherit. It doesn't, you don't have to use the word inherit there. If you could say you could get the earth, you could live the earth, you could earn the earth. Inherit is a very biblical word. If you look at Deuteronomy 4:1, I'll read it to you. Now, Israel, hear the decrees and laws I'm about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and may go and inherit the land of God, the God of your ancestors is giving you. So what does inherit mean there? It means kill and conquer. It doesn't mean that inheritance is usually a passive action, but inheritance in Hebrew, I just want to note, has a dual meaning of a past. You can have someone die and they bequeath things to you and you inherit. But in Hebrew, also we see in Deuteronomy, let me just bring it up, Deuteronomy 16, chapter 16, verse 20, we also have the same idea of Deuteronomy, specifically when they're in the land and they have to go and take land. So we see in Deuteronomy 16:20, follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land and inherit the land that your God is giving you. So what we see is sometimes inherit is translated as possess, but it actually means a lot of times take. So we see this active element, and I think it's really interesting where we talk about our binary attitudes, that in the Bible, the word inherit means not inherit, but possess or take. And over here, it might be also a subversive attitude of when it says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, it really means, but they will possess the earth, they will take the earth. It almost has like what is the one thing that the meek can't do? They can't possess. So I think we see this really interesting dichotomy of not only we have this dichotomy of kingdom of heaven versus inherit the earth, but we also have this dichotomy of the meek versus inherit the earth. That is not only opposite, but is also a complete change of attitude. And this is something that we see in the, I think, a progression now, because we see poor in spirit, there's a kingdom of heaven. It's just saying right now you're poor in spirit, it's your kingdom. You don't have to do anything. Blessed are the mourn, for they will be comforted. They will change a bit, as we talked about. If it's not 180, that's 160. It's not binary. And now we have blessed are the meek, for they will now take action. So we have the first one not changing, namely they are in the kingdom of heaven. Number 2, we have people who are adjusting. And number 3, we have people who are completely changing. So again, like I'd love to see an arc of all 5, 6, 7, 8 of them, but I think that we could see this progression that you were looking for, at least, of what is an active participant in the kingdom of heaven. And this is and the answer is, I think what we're learning from the sermon is that there's no answer. It's whatever part you want to take in it.
So, well, this is remarkable. So let me summarize. So you're saying the first part was the posture, right? Being poor in spirit, kingdom of heaven. It's do with posture. It's more into second.
Well, there's no
one.
verb. There's not even a verb, right? Theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Kingdom of heaven.
It's interesting. You could have said they will possess, just like this. They will inherit the kingdom of heaven. That would make perfect sense. But a verb, I believe, was actively left there and just made up what we would call an identity. Just like theirs is this.
So the first one, verse 3 was just a state of being, as in this is who you are, this identity, and by being this, you'll have this.
Yeah, second, and we argue because they're not adulterated by the negative attitudes, right?
Yeah. So and verse 4 was this internal shift. Even though you have mourning, but you will live happy. Like even though you feel mourning, the mourning is not going to go away, or that painful thing is not going to go away. It's still there, but even though it's still there,
you'll be comforted.
your posture is different. And this third one is where there's a verb there is a verb, as in they will do something, they will physically act on this, and they will inherit the earth. And you say this is, so we see a progression from which starts with a state of being to an internal shift in how people view. And thirdly, which is from the internal, it causes them to act, as in do something to inherit. Would
Yeah,
that
and
be
I'll be honest, like I did, there's a way to work out just for the rest. I don't want to read the verses like in depth, but just one knows the verbs. The next one, they will receive mercy. In other words, it's not something they are, it's not something that they will change, it's not something they will do, it's something they will receive. The next step is another kind of personality. It's someone who gets it. Maybe like, when we talk about where Jesus died for your sins, or that, it's an unjustifiable situation that you're getting, you get it not because of what you are, but because of external situations. And that will be what it means to receive mercy. And the last one.
That's further down. Let's
But you see the progression. And the last one, in number 8, they will see God. And that's already now not that you are doing, it's something that you now are able to ideologically see differently. It's like there's a change in your situation. Anyways, we could talk more about it when we do 7, 8, and 9, but I think we do see that there's this progression. And it could be even a chiasma, and that's, when we look at number 9, we'll see that they'll be called, it's also an identity. But anyways, we'll talk about that when we get to 6, 7.
So on this topic of verse 5, right? So blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Can this not be done to them? Like, do they have to do something to inherit the earth?
Well, I'm arguing that the word inherit, inherit, you're right. If inherit means inherit, then yeah, I have nothing to say. But I just noted in chapter 16 and chapter 4 that the word inherit doesn't really mean inherit when you're talking about land, which it does here. Inherit means to possess or to take.
You said chapter 16, verse 4.
No, I said chapter 16, verse 20, and chapter 4, verse 1. And we read them out loud, yeah.
So, okay. so what would this, again, thank you. What would have these words meant to the initial audience? As you said, they might not have had initial gratification, but also over time, as this sunk in, right? This would have been
it would have been like they would have seen the Isaiah parallels, hopefully, and they would have seen that he's not preaching a world that exists now. They would have said that, what does that mean?
Yeah, and it's primarily also because they don't have the sense of liberty, or they didn't have the freedom and the liberty we have right now. They lived they lived under an oppressive regime. And so with these words, would these have just meant something as high in the sky, pine again, some mystical fantasy world which is to come, which may come 1,000 years from now?
I don't know. I could tell you that in rabbinic texts, they do speak, as you just said, it was high in the sky. They do speak not only allegorically, but beyond any reasonable thing a person would say. And we can give you a couple examples of that. So I don't think this would have been out of context for first century. The question is, would have been viewed just as a symbol that, again, like, I don't want to say it, but like a throwaway. Okay, yeah, like treat, like you could always read this and say, treat the poor good, treat the meek good, treat the sad good. And I think if you just said that not as an identity about how you should view the world, but how you should be a good person to another person, I think that would have been completely fine. And I think a lot of people would have taken that way. These people are blessed. So, okay, so I shouldn't be a jerk to them. I should be nice to the poor. So I think that's how I probably would hear it if I heard it. But, there's a whole context of, for all we know, one thing I keep wondering is when people speak either subversively or they speak purposely out of the normal boundaries of what would be the hermeneutics of that century, are they doing it to push the boundaries, or are they showing that they are good teachers, or are they trying to say that, like, I have new teachings? Because why shouldn't you use the boundaries? What would be the best way to convey that information? And again, like just to finish where we started, it seems to me that Jesus always tries to be a revolutionary without being a revolutionary in these ways. Okay, Isaac, we'll call it a day.
Well, yeah. Okay, Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you.